welcome back to our second episode of Research Done Right. This one is titled Where to Start. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the basic vocabulary involved in research methods. Then we're going to talk about the importance of previous research and what is called a literature review. And lastly, we'll wrap up our discussion by talking about the different parts of a research paper. So if you recall, in the first episode, we learned at a greater scale about the importance of research methods, why we use them. We learned about skepticism and empiricism. So this lecture takes us one step further from that in terms of helping you understand how you can start working on your very own research experiments. So let's get started. Let's start by talking about some of the basic research vocabulary that you need to know. First of all, whenever we want to conduct a research experiment, typically we need to narrow it down to a research question. So where do these research questions come from? Well, the short answer is from the world around you. How many of you have experienced people watching, or you were out somewhere, or you felt something, and then you asked yourself, I wonder why I'm feeling this way, or I wonder why that person reacted in this way. So ultimately, all research questions stem from some type of curiosity within us. So the motivation to conduct scientific research derives from a natural curiosity we have about the world. Once we become curious, then we begin asking questions. So let's say that you have a particular question that you want to answer, then what you would need to do is narrow it down into what is called a research question. Research questions identify and describe a specific topic that you are interested in investigating, of course, with hopes to make some type of prediction or hypothesis, and ultimately to accurately answer that question. So hypotheses are, in a sense, a specific version of your research question. However, hypotheses are typically formed as statements, not as questions. So given that these are predictions or educated guesses, they are tentative, and at the current state, you don't know if they are true or if they are not true. So once you complete your experiment and you analyze your data, then you're able to determine if the hypothesis is true or if it is not true. So let's talk a little bit more about hypotheses. A hypothesis is a tentative statement. Tentative means it is temporary. It is not for sure. You don't know the accuracy of this statement yet, but it is your prediction. It is your hunch. It is your educated guess for how the experiment will play out. So in other words, it's a tentative statement or question that is currently awaiting evidence to either support it or refute it. Evidence is gathered and evaluated through data. So if you remember back to the scientific method, we talked about the various steps involved in conducting a research experiment. You would remember that after the hypothesis, you would have to start collecting data. So that data is your evidence to prove or disprove your hypothesis. Researchers also make specific predictions concerning the outcome of the hypothesis. And if you think back to your statistics class, you should remember that you have two possible types of hypotheses. The first is the null hypothesis. So if you think of the word null, null means nothing. Null means zero. So the null hypothesis typically says that there is no difference between the groups. There is no significant effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable. The alternative hypothesis would then say the complete opposite. So the alternative hypothesis would show a difference between the groups. It would prove that your hypothesis is true because typically when you are crafting your hypothesis for a particular research experiment, the researcher's prediction is usually not that there will not be a difference. The prediction is usually that there will be a difference because that's why you started this experiment in the first place. So for the most part, alternative hypotheses are the ones that researchers want to prove, but again, it really depends on the situation. Sometimes it's in the researcher's interest to prove that there are no differences between two different things. For example, if you are measuring the difference between two different versions of a smoothie, of a shake, right? A protein shake. One is advertising that it's very, very healthy for you and it has all of its nutritional facts listed on it. And in the other instance, you have a much more simple type of advertisement on the shake. And so you as a researcher are trying to prove that health-wise, the health benefits of both of these are going to be equal. So in this case, you would actually want to prove your null hypothesis and show that there is no difference between the health benefits of these two items, regardless of how they appear on the outside. So remember, it really depends on the type of research question you have to determine which type of hypothesis the researcher is actually interested in proving. Another important item of vocabulary that we'll talk about is the way we refer to those who participate in research studies. So we have a variety of terms that we could use. We can use participants, subjects, respondents, or informants. So typically the current version of the APA manual wants us to use the word participants. The word subjects used to be used, but there was conversation around the fact that the word subjects made people feel objectified. So instead of feeling like people, they felt more like things. So instead of subjects, the idea and the hope is to use the word participants. For respondents and informants, those are more likely to be used if you have participants completing a survey for you, as opposed to you actually conducting some type of interactive one-on-one experiment with participants. However, the main thing to remember is, number one, participants is probably the best term to use, and number two, whenever you are discussing your own research or writing your own research paper, you want to make sure that the words stay consistent. In other words, you don't want to make your hypothesis using the word participants and then later in your results section switch to subjects or respondents. So as long as you stay consistent with your terminology throughout your paper, you should be good to go. The next thing we're going to talk about are theories. When we think of psychology, we refer to it as a soft science, but when we think of things like mathematics or physics or chemistry, those are more referred to as a hard science. And if you think back to it, it's kind of really not surprising, right? We have a variety of different laws of physics, right? We have laws of chemistry. Even with mathematics, right? We have different formulas which are considered laws. And so the law in terms of science basically means that it will give you the same result every time it is executed. If we think about psychology, besides the laws of perception in Gestalt psychology, it's really hard to think of any particular laws relative to human behavior. And that shouldn't really surprise you because humans are so different from each other. So the best we could do is come up with theories. And the reason we use theories is because theories are relative to a particular topic, behavior, or phenomenon. And these theories are generated from coherent and logical recurring events and ideas. Recurring means that they happen over and over again. Similarly, how a law would happen over and over again. However, there are definitely exceptions when we apply certain things to human behavior, the human brain. And so because people are so very different from each other, these recurring events don't occur 100% of the time. So we can't call them laws, but what we do is call them theories. And so when we come up with theories, theories have two main goals. The first goal is to organize and explain human behavior. So once you come up with a variety of different observations related to a particular topic or to a particular behavior, we combine those observations together into theories. The second goal of theories is that they help us generate new knowledge by focusing our thinking on new aspects of behavior based on what is already known. So we know that we are constantly evolving. The world around us, our environment is constantly changing as well. And that means that the way we interact with our environment will also constantly be changing. So with these advancements, there may not be theories occurring as frequently as the changes in our environment are seen. However, what we do is we reflect on theories that we do have from the past and we see how we can apply them in new ways. Can you come up with new theories? Absolutely. But it's typically easier to adapt an older theory than to come up with an entirely new one. Because yes, while it is true that human behavior changes, it does so gradually. It doesn't change drastically. So the theories that we know from the past can definitely be applied to what we see today, however, with some slight modifications and adjustments. So again, the two main goals of theories is to organize and explain behavior and to help us generate new theories and new knowledge based on what we have, based on the information we have from old ones. Now we're going to talk about previous research and literature reviews. Why is it important to know about previous research? So imagine that you are interested in conducting your own research experiment and you have a particular research question in mind. You probably would want to know if anyone has ever had a similar question such as yours. You also probably want to know what other information out there exists on this same topic that you have an interest in. And so generally, the very first thing that you would want to do is look some of that information up. And once you do, you will learn that this previous research will actually help you to make your decision. For example, perhaps you have a hypothesis that you realize multiple other researchers have shared, and multiple other researchers also had the motivation to conduct their own research experiment to test that hypothesis. You can use their prior research to further support and add more evidence to your specific hypothesis, or perhaps on the contrary, you realize that all of the research that's been done on this topic is completely opposite of what you thought your hypothesis would be. So perhaps it would demotivate you from doing this particular experiment. However, the most interesting case would be, let's say you are very adamant and believing in your hypothesis, and all of the previous research you have found actually refutes the hypothesis you have, but you are certain and you have a strong hunch that if you were to do this experiment, you would get different results. And that is just more power to you. But the fact that you were wise enough and responsible enough to see what others have said about your particular topic is that much more leverage for you and for your experiment. So in a sense, you have the ability to play devil's advocate because you have the knowledge of what's been done before. So previous research does help us make decisions, but it also can reduce the cost and time it takes for us to conduct our own experiments. So again, it's very, very rare that you will come up with a research question or a topic, let's say, a topic that nobody else has ever studied, okay? That's typically kind of rare. However, you do come up with a topic and you put your own spin on the hypothesis, or your research question is a little bit more specific than the research that you found. But what you could do is you could look at the methodology that previous researchers have used. You could use their scales of measurement. You could use their surveys. You could look at what stimuli they used for their independent variable. All of that would reduce the time it takes for you to make completely new materials, and it would also reduce the cost for you to have any assistance or pay anyone to get those made afresh, right? So in essence, why reinvent the wheel when you already have access to other materials that have existed before your study? Doing previous research also clarifies experimental methodology and procedure. So perhaps you have a research question, you know what you want to study, but thinking about the procedure, everything that you would have to do step by step by step, that can get a little overwhelming. So why not check out what other people had done before? Perhaps there will be something that you can learn from and you can borrow. And perhaps you don't agree with something that happened in that procedure, so you can throw it out. But the fact is that you have access to all of that information when you do a literature review and you look through previous research. Previous research also helps provide additional evidence and increases your validity. So again, validity is kind of like your credibility. As a researcher or a scientist, you want to make sure that the things you write about and that your research is valid. Of course, there is a difference between truth and validity, but in our case, in the purposes of this conversation, validity refers to how credible your research is. How accurately did your variables actually measure what they intended to measure? So imagine if you are a new researcher and this is your first experiment, you may not know where to start, and you may think that you have a great idea for coming up with your own materials or measurements. That may be entirely true. However, given the whole purpose of previous research and the way APA, the American Psychological Association, works as far as empirical studies go, the point is that you do read other people's work, hence the peer review process. So it's much better for you to cite and allude to a reference or a tool or a measurement or a stimulus that someone else has used in another previous study that has already been peer reviewed and approved to be a valid source. So now, instead of you coming up with your own, not to say that it's invalid, but it hasn't been accepted as valid kind of sources of measurement or tools for your study, instead, you're actually just using what's already been approved and accepted as valid in your study. Hence, that increases your validity, and now you look like a more credible researcher because you know your stuff and you did some previous research. Okay, so we understand that previous research is really important. How do we locate this past research? Where do we find it? Well, for the most common references, we typically look in journals, and journals typically are peer reviewed. That means that there are certain journals that cover very specific topics. So journals are not like an encyclopedia where you can find anything about everything. In fact, journals are geared towards one or two areas of behavior. And each journal has what is called an impact factor. If you think about the word impact, impact is something powerful, right? It means to have an effect on. So impact factor is a good thing. Each journal has an impact factor. And what this impact factor is it's the frequency with which the average article from that journal has been cited in a particular year or period. Sometimes it's on a quarterly system, sometimes it's monthly, sometimes it's yearly. But generally, the impact factor represents how often articles from that journal are being cited. Naturally, the higher the impact factor, the better the journal. Also, when it comes to impact factors, it shows us how strict a particular journal is. When we say that a journal is strict, it means that it's very competitive and it's hard for you to get published in that particular journal because they choose the creme de la creme of research, right? They want to put the most important and the very, very highly prestigious articles in this journal because they maintain a particular level of quality. So a higher impact factor means that it has more articles cited from it, hence it's more effective for the public who actually read that journal, but it is also more strict. Each journal also has what is called aims and scopes. You can think of aims and scopes as kind of like the mission statement for a particular journal. And in the aims and scopes, you will find 6 different things. The first one is the purpose of the journal. So this should be important to you, A, as a researcher who is looking for a journal in which you can publish your own work, but B, it's also important because it's helpful to know the reference for where you're looking for articles for your literature review and that previous literature. So the purpose of the journal is written in the aims and scopes, as well as the acceptable topics. So remember, because I said that the journals are geared towards 1 or 2 specific fields, that's where the acceptable topics would come in as far as aims and scopes go. And then you want to think about the target audience. Who are the main readers of this journal? Who are going to be the main readers of your particular article and research experiment? So sometimes we conduct research that has implications for practice, like clinicians and therapists. Sometimes we conduct research that's more beneficial for educators. Sometimes the research we conduct is more influential for counselors, right? So it really depends on what your particular research is about, and the target audience in the aims and scopes helps you understand whether that journal would be a good match for something that you are writing about. The aims and scopes also show us the type of manuscripts that are acceptable for a journal. Manuscripts can include book reviews, literature reviews, empirical research papers, etc. So sometimes there are journals that focus strictly on book reviews. Book reviews could be of a self-help book, a textbook, etc. Anything related to the field, but in which the author is not talking about a research experiment that they conducted What the author does write about is a review of a particular book. So book reviews are definitely a type of manuscripts that are accepted to specific journals. A literature review, similar to the one that you would do prior to beginning your own experiment, is also a type of manuscript, but naturally would be much more extensive. So for example, if you are synthesizing and aggregating a variety of different articles related to a specific topic or topics, then you would combine those two into a literature review. So again, this article is not about a particular empirical research experiment. You're not talking about a procedure. You don't have methodology. It follows a completely different format, but it's still very, very relevant to researchers everywhere. So a literature review is another type of manuscript. And then research papers, of course, are very, very common as well. So these are the empirical papers that we've been talking about since lesson 1. And it's the one we're going to continue talking about for the rest of the course. It's the one that you are learning to write on your own, research experimental paper. The aims and scopes also have this very important information around the fees and the review process. So remember, for peer-reviewed journals, your articles are going to be reviewed by other professionals in the field, but nothing comes for free. So the aims and scopes also indicate to us how much it will cost to submit your article, how long the review process will take, how many reviewers there are, how many chances you get to submit your paper before they disqualify it if it's not reviewed properly, so on and so forth. So basically, all of the administrative and logistic things would appear in the aims and scopes. And last but not least, we have style guidelines and page length. So again, you have to understand that when you submit an article to a journal, it's very, very competitive. There are a lot of people out there who are interested in getting their research seen and published, and they want to be recognized for this research. So they have to limit you in terms of how many pages you can submit. They also are very specific with how many charts and how many figures there should be and where they should appear. Should you have 2 columns or 3 columns when you submit your paper? So there are a variety of different formats that are applicable to different journals. Now, these days, it's much easier to get the format down properly because these journals will typically send you a template, and all you would have to do is paste your text into that template. But you can imagine that before we had the luxury of doing such things, it was much harder to make sure that you have the format correct. So here we have a few samples of very popular psychological journals. At the top, you can see journals related to general psychology, such as American Psychologist, Contemporary Psychology, the Psychological Bulletin, etc. Then you have clinical and counseling psychology. So those are all the journals that focus specifically on those areas. Below that, you have experimental areas of psychology, and those journals focus on strictly experimental empirical research papers. Then you also have developmental psychology, applied areas of psychology, like applied psychology. So this is obviously not an exhaustive list, but it definitely shows you all of the different types of psychology journals that exist. So depending on the type of research you're interested in, and if you wanted to get your work published, you would probably look through these and try to find at least the category in which you think your article would fit in. Once you figure that out, you can explore the websites of each specific journal and look up their aims and scopes to see if it truly is a good fit for you or not. But besides journals, you can also use a variety of different databases that house articles related to psychology. For example, there's the PsycInfo database, there's PsycArticles, and if you don't have access to any of those, Google Scholar is another really great website where you can find information for your literature review. So to access Google Scholar, you just open google.com, and in the search bar, you type in Google Scholar. Once you select that from the search results, it takes you almost like into an entirely different database filled with only educational and academic related articles. However, it is interesting to note that if you are enrolled in a particular educational institution, your credentials should give you access to a variety of different databases because it is part of your tuition. So check out your library websites on your websites for educational institutions, and you should be able to explore around in there to see the vast majority of references that are available to you. All right, so we've been talking about this literature review. Let's talk a little bit more in detail what specifically it is. Each research study begins with a literature review. This is a brief explanation of past research on this topic. And for the past 20 minutes, we've been trying to understand why learning about previous research is important. So the current research that you find in your literature review may agree or disagree with past research. In other words, when you conduct a literature review, you shouldn't only be looking for one side of the hypothesis. You should definitely look for information that supports your hypothesis, but you should also look for information that refutes it, because this will be key when it comes to your discussion and to actually prove and frame what the results of your study were in relation to what previous research has said. Additionally, if you look at the results of previous research, that in fact may lead you to the purpose of your current study. In other words, you may have a hunch or you may have an opinion or a curiosity, right? Since that's where research questions stem from. Perhaps you have a particular curiosity, you start digging in previous research, and then based on what you find there, it will actually help you formulate your specific new research question, right? So it could lead you to the purpose of your current study. And lastly, references and cited articles in the bibliography of previous research can be used for you to conduct your own literature review. So again, remember, you have to be a bit of a detective when you sign up to be a researcher and when you start doing your own experiments. Yes, you have to look for previous research on your topic. Sometimes that's really easy, but sometimes that's hard, depending on how popular or how common your particular research question is. Maybe your research question is very, very specific and you find information related to one part of your question, but you can't find information related to the other part of your question, and that's totally okay. So let's say you're searching and digging and then boom, suddenly you find one amazing article. You've been digging for hours and now this one article gets surfaced and it is exactly what you've been looking for. The wise thing to do would be to look at the references of that really good article to see where they got their references, and then you can refer back to the references they used in your own literature review. So in a sense, it's kind of like a snowball effect. Once you find one reference, look at the references of that reference to help you build up your literature review, especially if it's something that's very relevant to your research question. All right, and to wrap up our lecture today, let's talk about the anatomy of a research article. In other words, what is going to be expected of you when you write your very own empirical research paper. So at the top, you have what is called an abstract. The abstract, ironically, should be the very last thing you write as a researcher. The abstract is a summary. It's kind of like the high-level key insights of everything that happened in your experiment. Although it appears first when you publish something, it is actually written as the very last step, because the only way you can write a full summary of your experiment is once it's over. So there's no way that you can write it before you actually conduct the experiment. So the abstract is a very brief summary of everything that happened in your article. And oftentimes when you want to get your article published in a journal, the abstract is what you submit. And then if they become interested and they feel like it fits what they're interested in, perhaps then you can send the rest of your article. Okay, so we have the introduction. The introduction starts out pretty broad, right? And it's going to outline your problem. It's going to talk about past research. And ultimately, it's going to point to your specific research question. So again, it starts out pretty broad, and it brings it to a narrow point, which is, now here's my research question, and I'm going to tell you how I'm going to execute finding evidence to prove or disprove my hypothesis. One important thing to note about the introduction, it's really important to help people and readers understand the so what of your particular question. You probably want to indicate why this research question is important, who should care about it, why you care about it, and then start drilling down further into the previous literature and ultimately segue into your specific hypothesis. Once you state your hypothesis, now you need to tell everyone how you're going to go about conducting this experiment, and that is going to be written in the methodology section. So the methodology section is often the most difficult portion of the paper to write because of the level of detail that you need to include in it. The methodology is a detailed description of the design of your experiment, of your study. Almost so detailed that anybody who reads your paper would be able to replicate exactly what you did. So you can think of it almost as like a recipe in a recipe book that anybody should be able to cook up exactly what you've created. And there is a reason for this, right? Going back to validity and credibility, you don't want anything to be shady. You don't want anything to be unclear. You want your data and your research to be clean and transparent, and everybody should understand exactly what steps you took to arrive at the conclusions that you did. So the methodology section includes the materials you used. Did you use scales? What did the participants interact with? What did the participants see? So all of the materials for the stimuli. Then you also need to explain how you measured your independent and dependent variables. You also need to explain what your independent and dependent variables are. When we talk about measurement, we're talking about surveys, scales, point systems, coding. All of those things need to be explained in your methodology. How many questions did the survey have? What were the anchors? What were the answer choices? If you're doing an observational study, how long did you observe them for? Were you the only person who observed, or did someone else observe with you? So on and so forth. So as much detail as you can possibly give, you want to write it in the methodology section. So beyond the materials and who the participants were and how many there were, you also want to have a procedure section. In the procedure section, you basically list step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, exactly every single step you took from the moment the participants came to participate to the very last moment of data analysis, right? Which software did you use to analyze your data? Which analyses did you use, etc., right? All of those things would go in methodology. Okay, then that brings us to your results section. The results section are an objective report of the study results. So when we say objective, it means whatever your software, SPSS, or any statistical software that you use to analyze your data, whatever information it gives you, that's the information you put here in the results section. The results section is the smallest part of your entire research paper. And if you think back to your statistics class, in this section, you will state, not even explain, you will state the type of method, the type of analysis you use. So was it an ANOVA? Was it a t-test? Was it a correlation? Was it a MANOVA? Was it an ANCOVA? Right? What type of statistical analysis did you use? What was the significance? Remember, significance, statistical significance is determined by a comparison of your significance value and your alpha level, your error level of 0.05. If your significance level is less than 0.05, then you do have statistical significance. If your alpha level is greater than 0.05, you do not have statistical significance. So ultimately, these are the things that go in your results section. It's very short. You don't explain anything in your results section. And this is also the place where you might want to put a chart or a table if you have a lot of quantitative data that you need to display. This is also probably a good place to throw in a graph. So the results section is very, very technical. But once you get to the discussion, this is, in my opinion, the most important part of the research paper. The discussion section is where you can actually show the importance of your research. This is where you interpret the results. This is where you say, in normal English, instead of in mathematical terms, right? This is where you say what happened in the results. You explain the mathematical technical portion from the results section in your discussion. And more importantly, you link it back to your hypothesis, but also to what previous literature was saying. So did it counteract the previous literature, or did it in fact support it? So ultimately, what happened with your hypothesis? Did you prove it or disprove it? And how does that relate back to the previous research that you found in your literature review? The discussion is also the place where you discuss implications, right? For whom is this information? Who should care about it? Who can benefit from it? Yes, you may have mentioned some of that in the introduction, but again, the discussion is kind of like a recap of what you said in the introduction, but now applied in a much more specific way. So the discussion also has a section called limitations, right? So as researchers, we're humble and we're also not perfect. So it's also our responsibility to indicate what went wrong in our study. The limitation section is also a way to say, if I had a chance to do this study again, here's what I would do differently. And this limitations part is also going to be really, really helpful for other people who read your article. So let's say they want to conduct a similar experiment. They'll look at your limitations and see, oh, what didn't work out for you? So it's something that they have on their radar and they could try to mitigate when they conduct a similar study. So the discussion, as I mentioned, is the juiciest part of your article. You can really make a statement and, deliver this so what take-home message that people will remember, right? And given primacy and recency, people remember the first and last thing that they read. So you definitely want to make your discussion section strong. All right, and then once you've expressed everything that you needed to express in your discussion, your references is what appears at the very end. So references are similar to a bibliography, but in APA we call them references. And this is basically a list of all of the sources of information that you use to write your paper. Typically, the most acceptable references are going to be peer-reviewed articles, but perhaps you listened to a lecture, or perhaps you watched a video, or perhaps you attended a seminar, right? That in which you used information from any sources of those mediums. You can definitely include those in your references as well. Books and book chapters also would belong here. Newspaper, magazine articles, anything and everything that you use that contributed in some way to this particular research paper should go into the references. And APA has very specific formatting for how these references should be written. And you can definitely look those up in the APA manual. The 7th edition is the most current, I believe. And so there are a variety of other online tools that can help you with proper formatting for references. But again, just know that APA for psychology research, we do have a very specific type of format that is different from MLA or any other types of references. All right, so that brings us to the end of our discussion for where to start when you want to start conducting your own research experiments. In this lecture, just as a recap, we talked about some of the basic research vocabulary. We also talked about the purpose and importance of previous literature and literature reviews. We learned about where to find previous literature. And last but not least, we dissected the anatomy of a research article. So hopefully this was helpful for you. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you next time on Research Done Right.